Race, ethnicity, and religion are social constructs, ways that people have invented to divide us from them. While these distinctions are not inherently harmful, they become problematic when mutual respect and bridging social capital are lacking. In the competition for resources, unchecked bigotry and ignorance can erode the social landscape, creating deep divides. The price of bigotry is steep. It negatively impacts individuals, entire societies, and ultimately the world. For a society, the consequences range from reduced productivity and economic growth to the erosion of trust. Lower productivity and economic growth exacerbate poverty and inequality, harming many people's life chances. When segments of the population are marginalized based on race, ethnicity, or religion, their potential contributions to society are diminished, stifling overall progress and innovation. The erosion of trust within a society is particularly damaging, as it undermines social cohesion and increases the likelihood of violent conflict. Distrust breeds fear and hostility, which can lead to social unrest and destabilization. These internal conflicts can spill over national borders, affecting neighboring countries and contributing to global instability. Moreover, the global consequences of such divisions are profound. In our interconnected world, the problems faced by one country can quickly become international issues. Social unrest can disrupt global markets, migration flows can increase due to conflict and economic hardship, and international relations can be strained by humanitarian crises. Addressing global inequality requires recognizing and dismantling these harmful social constructs. Promoting mutual respect and understanding across diverse groups is essential. Societies must invest in education, inclusive policies, and community-building initiatives to bridge divides and foster social capital. By doing so, we can create more equitable and cohesive societies, reducing poverty and inequality by enhancing global stability and prosperity. The lack of citizenship globally is a devastating reality that strips individuals of their fundamental rights and human dignity. In many parts of the world plagued by ethnic and religious conflicts, certain groups find themselves effectively stateless within the borders of their own countries. Despite being born and raised there, they are deemed illegal immigrants, denied access to basic services like education, healthcare, employment, and even food assistance. This systemic discrimination renders entire populations as non-persons, lacking legal recognitions or protections. They exist in a perpetual state of vulnerability, unable to access the social safety nets or seek recourse for injustices. Children grow up deprived of opportunities, trapped in cycles of poverty and marginalization within the only home they've ever known. Rectifying this crisis requires addressing deep-rooted prejudices and implementing inclusive policies that enshrine equal citizenship rights for all, regardless of ethnicity or creed. Every human being deserves to be recognized and treated with dignity in their nation of origin. In a world divided into sovereign states, statelessness represents a form of punishment more severe than torture itself. It strips individuals of their legal identity, rendering them invisible in the eyes of the law. National policies determine who is included or excluded, creating a precarious existence for those deemed stateless. Furthermore, some nations lack a state entirely, leaving their people subject to the rule of others, yearning for self-governance and autonomy. The impacts of statelessness are devastating, denying access to fundamental rights in education, employment, healthcare, and social security. Psychological effects range from anger and resentment to depression as the stateless become marginalized and financially insecure in a world that fails to recognize their existence. Discrimination begins at birth, shaping the life chances from the very start. Minority groups face higher mortality rates, often stemming from preterm related issues linked to lifelong institutional discrimination. In wealthy nations, impoverished areas share more similarities with developing countries than their affluent counterparts, highlighting deep-rooted disparities. This discrimination persists throughout life, manifesting in healthcare and education, where intersectional oppression compounds the challenges faced by marginalized communities. Lower quality education in disadvantaged areas fails to adequately prepare students for higher education, perpetuating a cycle of inequality that spans generations on a global scale. Socially constructed differences among people serve to artificially divide our one human species into contrived categories of us and them. Concepts like race and ethnicity are human inventions that are defined and understood differently across various parts of the world. Prior to the rise of modern nation-states, regions were occupied by hundreds of different and distinct ethnic groups coexisting autonomously. However, as nations formed by uniting diverse communities, many of these ethnic identities became subsumed and subjugated under the broader national identity, rather than being recognized as equal citizens. This forced assimilation has proved deeply problematic, as evidenced by separatist movements, persecution, and even genocide against ethnic minorities. While race is a social construct devoid of any inherent biological meaning, its constructed meanings have very real consequences in determining people's life chances and access to opportunities. How race is delineated varies across countries and can even be fluid within a nation over time. However, these arbitrary racial categorizations consistently serve as the basis for inequalities and disparities. Despite our shared humanity, we have erected these artificial social boundaries that sort people into hierarchical in-groups and out-groups based on characteristics like ethnicity and race. These divisive constructs foster discrimination, conflict, and unequal treatment, impeding our ability to recognize our commonalities as one human family. The social construction of race has had far-reaching and pernicious impacts on how we perceive and treat one another based solely on superficial physical traits like skin color. Deeply ingrained prejudices dictating that lighter complexions are inherently better and darker complexions are worse have become globalized ideals, driving multi-billion-dollar industries like skin lightening creams. This racialized conception of desirability rooted in pigmentation is utterly meaningless from a biological standpoint, and yet the artificial meanings and hierarchies we have imposed upon different shades of complexion yield stark, tangible consequences in people's life trajectories and access to opportunities. Those perceived as having darker, less desirable skin tones face systemic discrimination and diminished life chances across domains like education, employment, and social mobility. The fact that such an arbitrary physical characteristic can determine privilege and oppression reflects the insidious power of our socially constructed racial categories. Deconstructing and dismantling these harmful prejudices is imperative to remedying the racial inequalities they fuel. Racialization refers to the active process of constructing racial categories and ascribing meanings to them for political, social, and economic purposes. In early America, divisions were initially based more on social class rather than skin color or race. Both Africans and European indentured servants could earn freedom and worked alongside each other under brutal conditions. However, as the African labor force became increasingly cruel due to declines in European immigration and the Native American population, the lines between white and black servitude began to calcify. Poor whites started identifying themselves as part of the broader white racial group, distinct from enslaved Africans, in order to maintain their perceived superiority. This racial segregation was reinforced through racial capitalism, the use of racial ideologies and discriminatory policies to concentrate economic power and justify the exploitation of black labor. Enslaved status was determined by the maternal line. Black codes restricted freedoms, and the U.S. Constitution itself denied voting rights to black men, codifying a racial hierarchy. Scientific racism provided pseudoscientific justifications for these oppressive systems of racial domination and discrimination that continued to disadvantage African Americans as well as subsequently Asian, Southern European, and Mexican immigrant groups long after slavery's abolition. What began as fluid social classes became calcified into rigid racial categories through intentional processes of racialization driven by desires to preserve power structures rooted in economic exploitation and white supremacist ideologies. Dismantling these oppressive racial constructs remains an ongoing struggle. Global racism is a pervasive force that constructs artificial ethnic divides to serve economic, political, and social agendas. Dominant groups assert their supposed superiority and recategorize other ethnicities as distinct others to solidify oppressive hierarchies. Pseudoscientific theories like social Darwinism are invoked to rationalize the subjugation of minorities. Legislative acts have been used to systematically strip ethnic groups of citizenship, rights, and protection. Discrimination manifests through color hierarchies that privilege lighter skin tones, as well as deeply entrenched caste systems that enforce hereditary inequality. Even where anti-discrimination laws exist, racist attitudes and behaviors persist. Marriage restrictions across racial and ethnic lines aim to preserve ethnic purity. Minorities face blatant wage discrimination in employment. Overall, global racism denies ethnic minorities equal human rights and dignity based solely on the perceived racial identity and heritage. Eradicating racism requires dismantling these pernicious systems of oppression founded on myths of ethnic supremacy. We must reject all ideological and institutional pillars that enable the dehumanization of ethnic groups worldwide. Indigenous communities, the first peoples of their lands, face systemic marginalization and human rights violations globally. Despite comprising only 6% of the world's population, they account for 19% of those in extreme poverty and have a life expectancy 20 years lower than non-indigenous groups. Colonial domination forcibly seized indigenous territories, drawing artificial borders that divided their peoples and cultures. Even where territorial autonomy has been granted in theory, practices of neoliberal globalization enable extractive industries to expropriate and degrade indigenous lands' rich resources. This land dispossession displaces communities under undesirable areas, decimating traditional lifeways. Indigenous peoples are routinely denied the rights and freedoms guaranteed under international law. These include recognition of their existence, ownership of ancestral lands and resources, self-determination over development policies affecting them, and respect for their histories, legal systems, and cultural contributions to humanity. Upholding the rights of indigenous communities is crucial for preserving their cultures, enabling their self-governance, and undoing the injustices of colonial oppression. Meaningful reconciliation and inclusion of indigenous voices and decision-making is essential for their empowerment and well-being. Indigenous sovereignty and land rights are inextricably linked to the preservation of indigenous cultures, identities, and ways of life. While treaties grant many indigenous nations theoretical sovereignty within nation-states, the right to true self-determination is often overridden by federal governments. Land is integral to the indigenous peoples. It enables them to maintain traditional livelihoods, practice their religions, and uphold sustainable relationship with the environment integral to their cultures. Dispossession from ancestral lands through exploitation by extractive industries, agribusiness, and development projects continues to displace communities and degrade ecosystems. Despite international laws affirming indigenous land rights, legal encroachments persist, denying indigenous sovereignty over resource use and religious and cultural land practices. In the U.S., courts have failed to guarantee First Amendment protections for Native American sacred sites during land use conflicts. Socioeconomic poverty among indigenous groups stems from this fundamental denial of their territorial rights and autonomy. Securing true equality, social, cultural, economic, political, hinges on honoring indigenous sovereignty and land stewardship free from corporate and state interests. Only then can the legacies of displacement, exploitation, and cultural erosion be reckoned with. Human rights violations and entrenched structural discrimination severely undermine the life chances and pursuit of dignity for racial, ethnic, and religious minorities across the globe. In many countries, minorities face systemic denial of fundamental freedoms. They are arbitrarily arrested, tortured, forced into labor, and banned from religious pilgrimages central to their faiths. Minority groups are often rendered invisible, with governments refusing to even recognize their existence or historical contributions to the nation. Popular dissent against such injustices is frequently met with state violence and armed suppression of protest. Institutionalized discrimination is pervasive, barring minorities from equal access to housing, loans, quality health care, policy representation, and equitable inclusion in all spheres of social, political, and economic life. Minorities are relegated to impoverished areas lacking adequate transportation, disproportionately exposed to crime, and denied pathways to upward socioeconomic mobility. Anti-discrimination laws aimed at codifying equal rights have proven inadequate in combating deep-seated prejudices and discriminatory structures. In fact, more legislative efforts have constrained minority rights than protected them. Individual acts of bias compounded institutional marginalization. Ultimately, egregious human rights violations and the systemic disenfranchisement of minorities from full societal participation and self-determination erode their inherent human dignity. Overcoming these injustices requires comprehensive legal reforms, enforcing accountability, and proactively dismantling all xenophobic, racist, and discriminatory barriers to equality. Religious discrimination remains a pervasive global issue, transcending borders and manifesting in various forms from subtle prejudice to outright violence. No nation is immune to religious hostility, whether it stems from individuals, groups, or the government itself. Discrimination can be institutionalized through laws and policies that grant privileges to certain groups while denying rights and opportunities to others. Social hostility, both violent and nonviolent, against racial minorities is widespread, denying equal life chances and violating fundamental human rights. The consequences of religious discrimination are severe, even escalating to crimes against humanity. History has repeatedly taught us that government favoritism, restrictions, and social hostilities lead to persecution, discrimination, and violent conflicts. In contrast, religious freedom and the absence of government favoritism promote greater stability and peace. Given the extent of religiously fueled terrorism, violent conflicts, and political dysfunction, it is crucial to illuminate the factors that enhance religious freedom and mitigate religious restrictions and social hostilities. Failing to address this issue perpetuates a cycle of discrimination, where one's religious affiliation could cost them their lives, a price no human should ever have to pay. Religious freedom is a fundamental human right enshrined in the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and recognized in various regional declarations. It is a hallmark achievement of cultural globalization with nearly universal recognition and national constitutions. However, despite this widespread acknowledgement, complete religious freedom remains rare, often more a promise than a reality. Religion plays a vital role in reinforcing solidarity among communities of believers, connecting them to what they perceive as sacred. Religious practices and rituals are essential elements of demonstrating reverence and for many faiths attaining salvation. Rituals also reinforce group solidarity and certainty of belief. Religion is institutionally organized, and these institutions are part of society's social structure, necessitating some form of relationship with the state. These relationships can range from alliances between dominant religions and the state to antagonistic situations where religions perceived as threats face persecution. Consequently, various arrangements exist, with varying levels of advantage or disadvantage for specific religions. Religious rights are unique due to the historical and cultural relationship that dominant religions share with society. Religious devotion can mobilize group action, allowing religious groups to accrue social and political power. Many individuals prioritize their religious identity over their nationality, leading religious organizations to mobilize believers for social and political movements, pressuring for favorable legislation and restrictions on other groups. Cultural traditions are often invoked to cast minority or new religious movements as dangerous, engendering strong social pressures to restrict or outlaw them. Religious freedom remains a contentious issue on a global scale, with two measurable dimensions of religious discrimination: government restrictions, religions, and social hostilities directed toward religious groups. Because religions are embedded in societal institutions, they often compete for resources. The most populous religion has an advantage due to potential alliances with the state. This alliance can provide the dominant religious organization with privileges, financial support, and legislative backing for its agenda, while political leaders gain the support of the religious group's adherents. However, the societal price is increased religious restrictions on competing religions or cultural groups, and the imposition of a religious agenda in the political realm. Government favoritism towards a particular religion is a strong predictor of religious restrictions. Analysis suspect that such restrictions can contribute to radicalizing youths. When social movements or political parties mobilize along religious lines, it becomes a powerful predictor of violence. Religious restrictions rarely function as intended, as measures designed to enhance state control and public order are likely to produce conflict and violence. Contact across religious groups can either increase or decrease conflict, depending on the context. Shared goals, equal status, interdependence, and support from authorities facilitate positive relations, a common tactic in combating prejudice and promoting peace. Conversely, differing interests, inequality, lack of support, and competition generate conflict. Extreme forms of nationalism often underlie the justification for extreme measures taken against religious groups in countries labeled Countries of Particular Concern, or CPC, where imprisonment, physical punishment, and death sentences are imposed for activities considered freedom of belief and expression in most Western democracies. Social hostility toward individuals based on their religious beliefs or lack thereof is a pervasive issue on a global scale. Government restrictions and societal prejudices often reinforce each other, creating a vicious cycle of discrimination. Legal codes that penalize certain religious beliefs or practices can incite people to perceive threats even where none exist. Conversely, escalating social hostility provides governments with a perceived mandate to pass discriminatory legislation or intensify unjust treatment, even in secular societies. When individuals, particularly those from marginalized communities, are perceived as challenging the dominant or official religion, or is as a threat to the societal status quo, the consequences can be severe. No country or region is completely free from social hostilities against religious groups and individuals. Government and societal hostility toward religious minorities tend to reinforce each other, with nations high in one dimension often exhibiting elevated levels of the other, perpetuating an environment of intolerance and oppression. Confronting discrimination and persecution on a global scale requires a concerted effort from various actors, as human rights violations are not merely internal affairs of countries. As emphasized by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Religious Freedom, governments have the primary responsibility for respecting human rights within their borders, but the responsibility is not exclusive. Human rights are a national and international concern. International organizations, global civil societies, the private sector, and national governments and civil societies all must play a role in addressing this issue. Every society bears responsibility to safeguard human rights, whether through persuasion or coercion. The UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights has global responsibility for protecting human rights, partnering with various entities to set standards, monitor situations, and implement policies and reforms. National human rights institutes assist governments in identifying violations and developing necessary infrastructure to ensure human rights, from national laws to educational systems. Regional governmental associations must insist on respect for human rights within member countries and be prepared to act on established sanctions when violations occur. They must also ensure domestic laws prohibit discrimination and political systems ensure representation. Where governments have signed international treaties regarding human rights, the international community must hold them accountable to enshrine equal rights and protection for racial, ethnic, religious minorities and all gender identities and sexual orientations in their national constitutions. Purging domestic laws of discriminatory and prejudicial provisions should follow. Confronting discrimination and persecution on a global scale requires addressing the issue of political representation and inclusion. As long as dominant groups diverge widely in the perceptions and minorities remain underrepresented in decision-making bodies, legal chances to ensure equal rights are unlikely to occur. Threats to voting rights further erode the life chances of minorities. To promote greater inclusion, some countries have implemented quotas to ensure minority representation in elective offices. However, this approach needs to be handled cautiously, as ethnic and religious group boundaries often align with partisan cleavages and societal divides. Factors like the number and size of minority groups, their geographic dispersal, party competitiveness, and access to information all influence the effectiveness of quotas and achieving empowerment rather than tokenism. Additionally, the cost of financing campaigns can be prohibitive for potential minority candidates, and many lack access to political education and mentorship opportunities. Establishing minority sections within parties can provide support, specialized training, and designated fundraising channels, while also broadening discussions on minority issues and developing platforms to address them. Ensuring voting rights is crucial, with international election observation and monitoring playing a vital role in increasing electoral competitiveness and adherence to principles of free and fair elections. International bodies and individual countries should impose warnings and sanctions for human rights violations, including infringements on free and fair elections. Civil society organizations, or CSOs, and governmental agencies working on the ground serve as vital bridges between local actors, national governments, and international agencies in confronting discrimination and persecution globally. By forming partnerships, these entities can become effective agents of change. One notable example is the International Association for Religious Freedom, IARF, founded in 1900 as the world's first international interreligious organization dedicated to promoting freedom of religion globally. Such organizations play a crucial role in advocacy, raising awareness, and facilitating cooperation across diverse stakeholders to address human rights violations and advance religious freedom worldwide.